So scapegoat mechanism means a group is in crisis, and suddenly such a group can solve this crisis when one person hits another very strongly, and others observe that and imitate again.
Is it the congestion of resources? Is it the congestion of mates that causes this emergent property of violence to social systems?
Bergson describes the early religion of early human tribes, described it as static religion with no individuality, which really is the spirit of the group.
Welcome everybody to the Robert Meets World podcast, the show where we talk about all matters of the metaphysical to the practical and everything in between. Today, I am bringing yet another fantastic guest onto the program in a slightly different direction that we haven't taken before, but we have brought up some of the ideas that this man has studied. His name is Dr. Wolfgang Palaver, and he is a distinguished scholar in the field of political theology and the philosophy of Rene Girard. From the 2002 to the 2023, Dr. Palaver was the professor of Christian social thought in the Institute of Systematic Theology at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. His research focuses on the intersection of religion, politics, and violence, drawing extensively on René Girard's mimetic theory. He's offered a numerous number of books and articles exploring themes on sacrifice, modernity, and in specific, he is the author of a phenomenal text entitled René Girard's Mimetic Theory, which provides a comprehensive perspective and synthesis of the Girardian theory of mimetics. Currently, he is teaching part-time and lecturing at the University of Brixen in Italy. Dr. Palaver's works focus on critical insights into the underlying mechanisms of human conflict and the potential for transcendence through understanding of mimetic desire. So in this conversation, I want to talk to you, Dr. Palaver, about Girard, mimetic theory, the sacred, and exploring all manner of this very comprehensive theory that Girard has sort of synthesized through the years. So with that being said, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for your invitation and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Dr. Palaver, if we can start at the sort of beginning, and I'm going to ask for a Herculean task, which is to provide a sort of introduction to this concept in your own words of mimetic desire, the scapegoating mechanism, and the sacrificial crisis, which underpins a lot of Girard's thoughts to sort of set the boundaries here of this conversation.
Yeah, whenever I present Girard's mimetic theory, I also always emphasize there are three essential pillars. So the first pillar is more his anthropological insight that human beings are desiring in an imitative way. They borrow the desire of others. And in a second stage, he started to study the origins of human culture and discovered that the scapegoat mechanism, an unconscious mechanism, was decisive to create a culture, how cultures deal with human violence, violence that easily springs from mimetic rivalry, a possible outcome of mimetic desire. And in a third stage, he started to focus more strongly on biblical literature, on biblical texts, and discovered that the Bible includes a lot of those insights he found in European literature and in mythological texts from ancient Greece and other cultures, and discovered that the Judeo-Christian perspective has a special view of human culture and partly overcomes the scapegoat mechanism and shows a way out of this structural violence, not without its own dangers coming along with it.
Mm-hmm. To start with the first pillar then, the anthropological insights, Girard looks into sort of the basis, anthropologically speaking, of human desire. And whenever I try to approach the question of violence within social systems, I always am curious if it's simply an emergent phenomenon based on the, I guess, animal side of ourselves. Is it the congestion of resources? Is it the congestion of mates that causes this emergent property of violence to social systems? Where does that anthropological insight begin around this functional problem of violence, which seems to be the sort of generator of this problem of conflict?
Yeah, Girard is an expert on the sources and the reasons why violence so easily breaks out between human beings. But I caution a little bit because his basic insight is about human beings as imitative beings. So imitation, the Greek word for it is mimesis. Imitation is essential for becoming a human being. We learn the language by imitating other human beings. We start thinking by mirroring other human beings. So it would be impossible. And about 200 years ago, they even tried to have some cruel experiments. What would happen to a child if it's completely excluded from any kind of exchange and relation with the other human beings? And those poor creatures just died because we need the mirror of other human beings in order to develop as human beings. So that's the basic, and therefore we should not immediately connect mimetic desire, this imitation of desire, or this imitation of other people's directly with violence. So violence is a possible outcome, a highly likely outcome, but it's not necessary, because very often when mimetic theories describe people, make this very close connection that Girard is a thinker of violence and human desire is prone to violence. That's not true, because imitation is much more basic. We know today from science that mirror neurons play a very important role, and this imitative capacity of human beings is the root of empathy, is the root of caring for others, of feeling what others feel, at the same time as it is the root of envy, jealousy, and those problems that so easily lead into violence. And so that just means that human beings, as soon as the primary appetites are fulfilled, we do not really know what to desire, but desire what others desire. And this is challenging this autonomy feeling that every person is in charge of himself. That's not true. We are very much dependent on others and imitate others, and those people who don't think that they imitate others are most of the time the most imitative people at all. We see it in fashion. We see it in fashion, in advertisements. So you don't need a deep philosophical insight to understand how fashion or advertisement works. And most of the advertisements show us successful people, cool people, and then the product is more on the sidelines. So we want to imitate cool people, and then if they have a certain shampoo or a certain soap or whatever, we think if we have the same thing, we will be as cool as the others. So the main insight, and you can find it already in Plato, in Greek philosophy, and in the Western Christian tradition with Augustine, human beings imitate what they adore. So what we think is cool, what we really appreciate and adore, we imitate. And this is a source of good and bad, depending what kind of people we adore and what kind of objects we long for and how desire then works out. So of course, as soon as desire is focusing on things that cannot be shared, or on love partnerships that cannot be shared, we are easily getting into mimetic rivalry, even into violence.
Mm-hmm. So the very process, I was rereading Things Hidden Since the Foundations of the World, one of Girard's final books, and they describe that the process of hominization itself, the process of becoming human, necessitates this imitative quality, right? We learn language through imitation, we learn to cut, we learn to hunt, we learn to walk. And so there is, it's almost like a dual-edged sword, where on one hand we have this incredible capacity to acquire skills, knowledge, and propagate that information through time, through that imitative capacity. But as a consequence to that imitative capacity, we have this triangle of object, model, subject, and mimetic desire. So within this insight, I guess, which goes to the anthropology, the very development of the hominization, Girard identifies this process, the triangle of mimetic desire. You brought up this point around the Bible, where there's an object, if we use the shampoo, for example, that is seen as desirable for its potential qualities, but really we become more interested in the person who's mediating that object, or I think what Girard calls the mediator, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And that process develops into this mimetic rivalry, where we become more interested in the other than the object itself. And this leads, I suppose, in a scaling order effect across a collective and a social system, to create this sort of conflict. And then Girard, to my understanding, describes then the what would you say, the panacea for that conflict as this concept of scapegoating. Is that correct? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about this scapegoating mechanism as a means to deal with this problem of mimetic desire and conflict?
Yeah, let's first go back to what you rightly said about the reason probably for mimetic desire. Girard took a term from Jean-Paul Sartre to understand the reason why we desire what others desire, why we imitate desire of others. And the term he took from Sartre is the lack of being. The lack of being means we all feel some lacks. We all feel that we are not full. We are not already completely in charge of everything. Maybe it goes even back to our sense of mortality and so on. And we guess in some way that other peoples don't have this lack. So they are cool. They don't worry as we all worry. And then we imitate them, and we think if we have the same objects and long for the same objects as the others, then we will be able to overcome our lack of being. So that's the deeper reason. And in a second stage, Girard asked himself and became aware this imitation of desire of others easily, not automatically, but easily results in conflicts, in violence. So how did human groups in the beginning of humanity deal with this problem? And by studying mythology and old texts and myths, he discovered that those cultures were the result of a scapegoat mechanism. So scapegoat mechanism means a group is in crisis. There are a lot of conflicts between different people in this group, and suddenly such a group can solve this crisis when one person hits another very strongly, and others observe that and imitate again the hitting of a person. And the more the people join this hitting of other persons, we can observe that, for instance, in the rite of stoning. So some people throw stones, and then others imitate this throwing of stones, and you suddenly have a snowball mechanism where suddenly the whole group joins against a single person. And after this person is killed or expelled, suddenly there is a certain peace, and this peace is now seen as caused by the same person that was persecuted. That's one of the most interesting insights of Girard, that the person who becomes a scapegoat is seen as the cause of the crisis. So suddenly the whole group is convinced as that if this person would not have been among us, we would be very nice and gentle and peaceful people. But this troublemaker made our life so difficult. And now we overcame this difficulty by expelling him or stoning him and killing him. But the sudden peace that appears in the group is also attributed immediately afterwards. And that's a thing we don't understand in our modern world, but it's very important to understand the foundation of human culture, that those people also attributed the peace that resulted from expulsion or killing the scapegoat, attributed to the scapegoat. So the scapegoat becomes the god of the tribe who persecuted it. I mean, already in the beginning, he's seen as a monster, even if he originally was just an ordinary member, an ordinary guy of the group. Could also be a woman, of course. But the more the group is convinced that this monster caused all the problems, it becomes a very strange creature. And when the sudden peace disappears suddenly in the group, it's also seen as a result of this strange being who causes trouble and donates and gives peace. And this merging of the absolute bad and the absolute good in the same person is the deep core of what we call today in religious studies the sacred. And it's also a description of early gods. If you go back to description of early gods in mythology, you will see almost all those gods are double-faced. They are very good and very bad at the same time. Only in the later world religions, you see a very strong separation. You have the devil as the incarnation of evil on the one side, and God as the incarnation of the absolute good. But the original gods are both at the same time, and that we can explain with the help of Girard's insight into the scapegoat mechanism and what results from it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Sartre's point around the lack of being. And I'm curious, with that nature of the mirror neurons, where you describe this empathic capacity of human beings, what was some of Girard's investigations into I don't want to say prehistoric religions, but like proto-religions with regards to these capacities for empathy, right? Or was that the emergent quality of the sort of biblical revelations, according to Girard?
I mean, the biblical revelation later helped him to explain and see the full picture. It's more difficult to see it by just focusing on mythological texts or studying those early tribes or early human groups. because there were a lot of strange things going on. So those groups seems to have no envy and no jealousy and no comparison, because they forbid any kind of mimetic rivalry. So they are very cautious to go into this field. And one of the famous anthropologists, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was at the center also of Girard's study, although Lévi-Strauss never touched mimetic theory at all, although they were in some way contemporaries. There is a famous insight by Claude Lévi-Strauss where he said, why is there no competition, no envy in early human groups? And he said, don't think they did not know about it, but maybe because of a traumatic experience, they avoided it as much as possible. And if you think from a Girardian point of view, what this traumatic experience could be, you end up with the scapegoat mechanism. That was an unconscious thing happening in a group, and of course told the group what to do and not what to do.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, is the idea that potentially these earlier cultures were not conceptually aware of the consequence of doubling, of rivalries, but that they had developed, what could you say, like adaptive cultural practices to handle this? And if so, what were some of those practices? Was it some of the dramatic? Go ahead, please.
I think they in some way had a deep knowledge of the dangers of competition, of mirroring, and all those things. So one of the things that Girard mentions again and again in his work is that there were many cultures who were afraid of twins. So whenever twins happened in those early families, sometimes one of those twins were killed or pushed into the forest and so on. And we don't understand immediately, but as soon as we have the full insight of mimetic theory, we understand that that was again something that made them aware again of the dangers of this traumatic experience they had in the beginning of their culture. So we have some clues of insight. So the whole culture was built around the avoidance of those things that led to deep rivalry. So in some way, those cultures were more aware of those dangers than our modern society. You know, if we that was the insight of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Those cultures avoided competition. And today we are in a world where competition is introduced on all levels, and we see it as a very important tool to bring us forward.
Mm-hmm.
But those cultures avoided competition by all means because they had a deep knowledge how dangerous competition could be. And it's still dangerous today, although we have some other means to handle competition. And competition, of course, brought us technologically, economically forward. So it's an engine, but it's a dangerous engine also in our times. If you think about climate crisis, environmental problems, it's the indirect result of a highly competitive society. And one of the most important small essays that Girard ever wrote was about after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, where he said, don't think that this is a thing of Islam and Christianity and a clash of cultures. It's the result of competition on a planetary scale. So we still struggle with competition, although consumer society is one of the possibilities. You know, if you provide all the people with the same goods, you can imitate, and all over the world can have the same shampoo or the same car or the same computer or the same gadget, but it has its side effects. I mean, we buy a lot of things and produce a lot of things that are resulting in a huge amount of waste, because many of those things that we buy and don't need are getting deposed immediately after we buy, and see that buying these things doesn't overcome our lack of being.
Mm-hmm. We are going to go back to the sacred process, the sacralization process, but you've mentioned here something very intriguing about the channel for redirecting or sequestering the consequences of mimetic desire through consumption. But you've also outlined something which I find quite intriguing in the global scale of the world, which is this consequence of massive convergence, where if every culture is buying the same shampoo or doing the same thing, we have this almost sort of collective convergence to the same things. You can see this in different architectures, like new architectures that are designed. You know, there's sort of just one or two smartphones available that all have the same form factor, and it makes me wonder about the what would you say, the rubber banding effect of that convergence, right? In the sense we're imitating one another, and then we're able to sequester this imitation because we can buy a product, the shampoo, the car, what have you. But if we get to a sort of locus of massive concentration of basically convergent desires, where everybody looks the same, everybody feels the same, does this not necessarily create a sort of global tension? And with that, is the solution is the solution more of a turning towards individuality? What are your thoughts on the way that I frame that?
I mean, you are asking about ways out of this problem, or I mean, for me, the most obvious field where we can observe what you just described is the world of fashion. So fashion is really taking us all in. So even if you are against the current fashion, you are against in a way that is structured by the fashion. And so we have this conformity of the non-conformists that Girard also described. I mean, I would say in some way you are already turning our discussion towards possible means to overcome the problematic side of mimetic desire. And according to Girard, and he was a little bit less outspoken, but he gave some hints, it means turning to deep insights of the religious traditions. Because religion is not saying avoid imitation, but gives you, for instance, in the Christian and Catholic version, the saints, many models of frugality, models who understood that craving for many consumer goods doesn't solve your inner problems. So it's not so much individuality, because individuality is not really possible, because we are relational beings. It means to relate to certain types of people, to have good models that help you to overcome some of the dangers coming along with mimetic desire.
Perhaps then, instead of rushing ahead to that side of the conversation, we'll return back to the sacralization process, which you mentioned this fascinating point that the individual who is scapegoated becomes this dual source of order and chaos, so to speak, the source of the peace, but also the source of the terror. And that duality of good and bad and order and chaos forms, in some senses, this perimeter which we could conceptualize as the earliest forms of divinity. Is that a fair way to think about how Girard thought about this sacralization process?
Yeah, I think you described it very well, and it's very important that Girard, in his early writings and later even more explicitly so, does not talk so much about religion. So that's a term very often used today in our times. Girard talked about the sacred. And it's very important because sometimes it's too quickly translated into religion. And if you know the whole German, in German, it's completely spoiled because the sacred is translated in German with the term of holy. So the distinction between sacred and holy in the German language is nearly lost. But then the whole thing is lost because according to Girard, we have to focus on two very different types of religion. If we use now the broader term religion, I studied in more recent years Henri Bergson's famous book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. And this is very important because it's also one of the sources of French thinking about religion and influenced Levinas, Girard, and many other French thinkers. And Bergson describes the early religion of early human tribes, described it as static religion with no individuality, which really is the spirit of the group, and distinguishes it from dynamic religion that is an individual mystical insight, as he exemplifies it with the help of the Jewish prophets in their desire and in their acting for justice. So you have two very different types of religion. So when we talk about the sacralization process, we're talking about the group spirit, the static religion, the sacred, that is very different from what we today understand when we use the term religion in view of the world religions of today.
So just to sort of delineate the two for the audience listening, the concept that Girard is referring to with regards to the sacralization process is more of the dynamism form. It's that individual insight per se, or a sort of it's not a systematic way of approaching living in terms of dictates of morality and these types of things. It is in itself the concept of something transcendental beyond being and humanity itself, versus the notion of static religion is sort of is more of what we view as, I guess, contemporary world religions, in the form of whether it's any of the world religions. Is that correct? Or
when we try to understand the sacred, then we have to give up individuality. We have to give up transcendence. So the sacred of the religion of early human tribes or groups doesn't have transcendence in the sense we understand this term today, because everything is identical with the group spirit. And the member of the group is completely absorbed in the morality of the group, and morality is a result of the pressure coming from the group. So there is a strong pressure of following what the group thinks is right, and there is no chance to break out of that. So to break out of that would mean you need some transcendence, you need an idea or an imagination that something could be very different, and that was not there in the world of the sacred. So when I teach mimetic theory, and especially the difference between these two types of religion, I often turn to a biblical passage that is very enlightening in this sense. That's the passage when a group of men approach Jesus, and they carry in the midst of them a woman that they caught in adultery. And they are a pack of completely collectively going together and completely convinced that this woman is very dangerous and very sinful, and they want to Jesus to join them in their collective action to stone this woman. And Jesus tries by all means to avoid to become contagious by this group spirit of the group. He looks to the ground, he writes something, so he tries to be not drawn into the group spirit of this group. And then he says, whoever is without sin should cast the first stone. And then it says in this biblical story that the older people first were slowly going alone, individually away. So you see how the transcendent intervention of Jesus to address them in their individuality breaks this whole group free into individuals, and they away alone. But in order that the group spirit is opened up to make every person think about his own role, you need a intervention from the outside. So it's the transcendence. So in the politically speaking, in the world of the sacred, the everything, politics, everything is part of this group spirit. And today we know it's not only in the Jewish tradition, but it's a worldwide axial revolution in different religions, when suddenly single people, prophets, special people stepped forward and said, well, I don't think the king is a god. I know of a God who thinks our world should be different than what the king, who seems to be presenting the divine reality, is different. Transcendence means that you have the imagination of a world that could be different than what the group, and very often a king or a king identified with God, is representing. And this is already the result of a different religion, a dynamic religion, or what Girard later called the world of the holy. So with the help of Girard, we very strongly have to distinguish between the sacred and the holy. And I did later on a little book about this distinction that's very dear to me, and we have to understand this fundamental seminal distinction in order to talk about religion. Very often we talk today about religion and violence, terrorism, all those things. And if this distinction between the sacred and the holy is missing, the whole discussion is going in a wrong direction or going nowhere.
Okay. So, to return to our point, the sacralization process, this process of expelling through the scapegoating mechanism to conceptualize this notion of the sacred, which is different from the holy, the religious, okay? And this, according to Girard, and I need you to keep me on track here, Dr. Palaver, but this sacred is essentially, what would you say, a culturally adaptive process that then gets propagated through time as a way to deal with the problem of violence that emerges from mimetic desire. And Girard, I believe, through his mythological analysis, saw that this was the sort of continual propagation through time. But and you use this brilliant word in your book, the effacement. There was an effacement, a hiding of this, the truth of what this scapegoating process was, because it's there is, as you mentioned, it's sort of the group sees, the first person gets hit, and then the group sees and they imitate, and then this happens, and then it's sort of like a blackout. Nobody knows really what happened, and then this there's no recollection of that event, but then this sacred, this revelation of this person caused both the problem and the peace comes, and then now it's getting propagated through time. and our myths then show this process happening.
Yeah,
But
maybe we should
please.
be careful with the term time, because
Okay.
those early cultures try to stop the time, or there is no time development in that sense, because those cultures try to repeat this original event through rites. So they sacrifice later on human beings or animals or prisoners from other tribes for the sake of the god who was the original scapegoat, and try to repeat the same again and again. So they don't want to have changes. They want to keep this static thing going on forever. So what they carry through time has no timely index, so there is no development. Whereas, of course, Christianity is a religion with a very strong emphasis on time development. There is a beginning, there is a linear development towards uh, a future of the kingdom. So those early tribes, and uh, Claude Lévi-Strauss described them as cold cultures, don't want to develop. They want to keep this original pattern forever, to freeze all the conflicts, to make all the same. So they didn't like changes, and I think that's also important, because it's a big difference to what we see in historical times, in history, where we see development, and there is no individual conscience. So it's all the group spirit and all the rules that the group creates in order not to have another outbreak of this traumatic violence that caused the original scapegoat mechanism. So you are right. Uh, this pattern is carried through the time without any time going into the pattern.
In a sense, if I may, it's this distinction of, I think, like the word is eschatological, the study of endings, right? The development in that, versus like Vico's kind of recorsico, this like effervescent recurring loop of learning the same things over again. And what Strauss and Girard are saying is that such prior societies or social collectives had in a way figured out the best way that they had to deal with that contagion of violence, and without trying to create or make new developments or do anything like that. It was just the recurring loop. And then over time, this gets conceptualized into the canon of myth and this types of things, which continues to propagate that kind of ritualistic and stories and these types of things. At which point, I think then Girard turns to some literary analysis to look through the writers to see this process. And I believe you described it in your book. You said that the writers like Cervantes, Proust, and Dostoevsky would undergo themselves a transfiguration, in that their earliest works, their latest works, which were considered in some ways as their masterpieces, were a criticism of their earliest works. For example, I think Dostoevsky's Poor Folk versus Brothers Karamazov, and this perhaps starts to set the stage of this moving in the direction towards what Girard believed was the way to handle the development of the scapegoating mechanism.
Yeah, but before we talk about this conversion of the great authors, and in a later article, Girard said, I mean, the first conversion happened already with the disciples of Jesus, or with the people who wrote the Hebrew Bible. And so we have to go back to the distinction and the similarity between ancient myth on the one hand and the biblical texts on the other. And Girard was struggling with that question for many, many years, because his book, La Violence et le Sacré, Violence and the Sacred, he was working on this book for 10 years and wanted to include the biblical texts also. So he wanted to give a comprising view of early religions and the biblical religions. And after 10 years, he had to cut short and just publish the book on the sacred, and was only later able to publish a second book, Things Hidden, that focuses on the biblical texts. The problem for Girard was that there is a similarity and a dissimilarity between the mythological texts and the biblical texts. And one of the helpers he found was Friedrich Nietzsche, who, interestingly, not a Christian and not a religious person in a official sense. Friedrich Nietzsche understood that there is a parallel between the mythological texts and the Bible. So both texts are describe martyrdom or persecution of single individuals. So there is no distinction in this sense what is described, and that's very important. But the distinction is the interpretation of the events. Whereas the mythological text say side with the group against the persecuted individual, against the scapegoat. The biblical text describe the same event, but side with the scapegoat and accuse the group of scapegoating. And this is a dramatic shift that enables a deep insight and overcoming of the scapegoat mechanism. And now there is one danger that I was not aware when I started to study that. You can think about, okay, in Greek mythology, you have texts who side with the group against the individual. And in the biblical texts, you have many texts who side with the persecuted individual against the group. So are the Greek people bad people and the people who wrote the Hebrew Bible good people, and hopefully I am the good side? No, it's a little bit more complicated. If you go back to the second Isaiah, you can see that the interesting thing about the biblical literature, and it's the same for the disciples of Jesus, that they in the beginning were also persecutors. So in the second Isaiah, they say, we felt he was wrong, this was a bad person. But then suddenly they saw, no, it was we who persecuted this guy. And if you talk about the disciples of Jesus, in the critical situation, they ran away or denied that they knew Jesus and were on his side. So the biblical texts are not the result of good people distinguished from the bad people who did mythological texts. The biblical texts are the result of people who were persecutors and through a special insight suddenly became aware of their persecution and rehabilitated the persecuted victim. So it's the same people, but in the one sense you have conversion and the other not. And later, the great writers that helped Girard to understand mimetic desire were also people who converted from their narcissism, from their pride in the beginning, but in the way they converted in some way are already following in this biblical pattern of conversion.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for reorienting. So it's at first it sounds like we need to, as you rightfully pointed out, it's the biblical revelation that comes first. It's it's the telling of the story of the scapegoat from the scapegoat's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yes.
is the referential frame change that then allows for a different view of history. And then that's where I suppose some of what you mentioned with the effacement comes into play, because you can't see that was the story being told, because the myths.
The big question is how was it able that those people converted? And then Girard makes a very interesting statement that he said, I always try to understand the biblical texts and the biblical tradition in an anthropological way. So I didn't make any kind of theological claims or didn't base my work on theological premises. And he, in that regard, was influenced by Simon Weil, who once wrote that the Gospels are first of all an anthropology and only in a second sense a theology. So in Things Hidden, if you look at that's a very interesting discovery. If you look to things hidden since the foundation of the world, uh, uh, Girard describes the conversion of the disciples of Jesus, that they were first part of the persecuting crowd in some way. But then he writes, after 3 days, they come to their own senses again and then wrote down and realized what really happened. In his most theologically and from a Christian standpoint of view, most mature work, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, which he calls Christian, an anthropological apology of Christianity. He writes that whoever thinks that the disciples just came to their own sense after 3 days doesn't understand anything. I once asked him and said, you yourself wrote that in the earlier book. He didn't like my question, but in the later book, he said it's a question of grace, or he describes that the real overcoming and insight into their own failings was when the disciples met the resurrected Jesus. So uh, the meeting of Jesus, who forgave them when he met them after Easter, is the precondition that they could really look into their own failings properly and then convert properly. There is I always use for my students, there is a famous painting by El Greco, a painting about the crying Peter, Saint Peter, who is crying. But the interesting, and you can find it, there are several versions of it. You can see Peter crying, and in the background of the painting, you see the open tomb where Jesus was buried, but was no longer there, and you see Mary Magdalene running from the very light, luminous open burial place to St. Peter. So when I saw the picture in the original in an exhibition in Vienna, the curator wrote that here El Greco is mixing up something before Easter and after Easter, because if you read the Bible, Peter is crying before Easter. So even when Jesus looks at him, he's reminded that Jesus predicted already that before the cock crows 3 times, he will betray him. But El Greco sees much deeper. That he says ultimately the resurrection was the deepest reason for Saint Peter and other disciples to understand what really happened and become aware of their own failings, of their own doings, and so on. And if you read Girard's I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, the last 20 pages, he describes, without knowing this painting of El Greco, the same thing, that he says ultimately it was the resurrection that enabled the disciples to convert. So it's a question of grace, resurrection, and Girard writes rightly that until this point, so it's about 90% of the book is written, and then he said, and now I have to go beyond the anthropological apology by making some theological claims and say there is a theological reason. So that was the more mature Girard compared to when he early started. he thought the disciples figured it out by themselves after a few days. You know, they were a little bit confused, but after 3 days they had the clear insight. But it's a a result of grace, of a special. It's the transcendence that is realized in the view of those disciples. And if you go back to the what today in religious studies is called the axial revolution, that changed the whole religious picture all over the world, more or less. It's the so what are prophets? Prophets are people who suddenly became aware of things or saw things nobody else saw by some kind of a special divine intuition, by a special awareness of how the divinity would look like at those things. So of course now I'm talking about things beyond the anthropological study, but I mentioned before Bergson's book, and he talks about as the source of the mystic individual religion. He uses the term mysticism, and he talks about the Jewish prophets who fought very often against the whole society by suddenly realizing there is something wrong, and they claim that it was God who told them, who enabled them to see what the others did not see.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if I was able to explain it properly, but it's yeah.
No, there's a tremendous amount in there, and part of me wants to inquire as to the what would you say, the concrete meaning of the symbolism of the resurrection. But prior to perhaps moving in that direction, you also brought up the literary conversion of different authors, right? The Dostoevsky, Cervantes, I think, was another one, and Proust, and mentioning that in the same almost as if a metaphor, as you mentioned, for the disciples' conversion, to see themselves as the persecutors, to then siding with the persecuted individual, the victim. When you look at the works of these authors, I think you mentioned that Girard points out that they too had essentially the same pattern. They were coming at it from a criticism of the individuals, this sort of narcissism, this vanity, and then their later works reveal a different perspective. And I'm sort of always reminded of Tolstoy, his book Confessions, where he describes it at the very start, his experience as a writer and being essentially, I can't quote the exact passage, but it was something like he was given praise for sort of condemning the other and condemning the world, and this world of those who condemned were as in itself empty. That was what gave him this vacuity of meaning, which led to his depression and so on and so forth. So with these writers, could you? Is it accurate? I guess the way that I've framed this conversion experience, or why did Girard use this? Why did Girard use these conduits of the writers in order to further his theory?
I mean, first of all, what happened to Girard himself, and that's also interesting, when he wrote his first book, Mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque, Desire, Deceit, and the Novel, he himself underwent a conversion. So he himself underwent a conversion. So the last chapter of this book is very important, because in the last chapter he describes how the great authors criticized their earlier works and their earlier narcissism, their earlier deep pride. They identified with themselves and suddenly saw that this is part of the problem, and by overcoming their egocentrism, their pride, they realized their mimetic dependence on others and were able to open up to others. And the same happened to Girard himself. So that's a very, for me, the first book of Girard is a mystical book in a deep sense. I mean, it's very hidden. It goes so far that in the last chapter, he uses a term coined by the French mystic and philosopher Simone Weil, and she talks about creative renunciation. So you have to give up your pride, you have to give up your egocentrism in order really to become a creator of great art. And great art means by no longer be egoistic, prideful, and so on. And Girard uses the term creative renunciation. I mean the French version of it, without mentioning Simone Weil at all. When I discovered that, I also asked him, and first he denied and said, no, I discovered because Simone Weil became important for the second book, Violence and the Sacred, but he said, I discovered her later. But then I showed him some more indications that he really was already reading Simone Weil at the early time. But I think he didn't want to quote a mystic like Simone Weil in the first book, which would have pushed his first book immediately into the box. Okay, that's another French mystic writer, and it would not have been taken seriously as a scholarly book. But if you study that first book, I mean, it's tremendous. It's in some way describing the conversion of the great authors, but it's also influenced by his own conversion. And it's a little bit easier to show the parallel to the biblical conversion with Dostoevsky, because in several works where this conversion is shown in Dostoevsky's works, the main figure of a novel is suddenly discovering a verse in the Bible and sees that this verse in the Bible speaks about his own life experience, about his own failings. And Proust, of course, who was not a believer, was not a Christian, but Girard shows that Proust had a similar experience by just using the same metaphors. So one of the metaphors that is used by Dostoevsky as the motto of the brothers Karamazov, if the corn of the wheat is not dying, it will not bring forward rich fruit, which is again an expression of creative renunciation. So that's explicitly used in Dostoevsky from a biblical perspective, but Proust uses the same metaphor in his famous novel about the remembrance of sins past. So, and then Girard shows, well, this pattern is so decisive that it covers explicitly Christian people like Dostoevsky and also agnostics like Proust. But it's a pattern that's already in the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Now, with this sort of landscape painted, so to speak, we've sort of seen that the biblical text shows the story from the persecuted perspective, and is that what fills in this loss of empathy, or that missing empathy, that Sartre's lack of being? I'm still wanting to understand how that problem is solved.
I mean,
if it's solved.
Yeah, the biblical tradition, of course, gives us, for instance, Jesus a model to imitate, and there are explicit passages in the New Testament. Paul says, "Imitate Jesus." We can imitate Jesus like he himself imitates his Father, and leading us to the source of creation, the source of being. So I was struggling when I wrote my book, and the chapter it's most dear to my heart, and I struggled a very long time, is the chapter on Sartre, because I tried to show that Girard takes the term lack of being from Sartre but I show at the same time he's far away from the philosophical ontology, from the whole philosophy of Sartre, by going more in a Christian direction. And you can suffer from lack of being, from mortality, by seeing I am not the creator of myself. For Sartre, for instance, it was already a horror to accept that we are creatures, that we are created by God, so we are not fully in charge of ourselves. We are not self-created. And of course, maybe there is a temptation to seek self-creation in some way, but the biblical legacy would be, and Jesus is a model because also Jesus can point to his Father, so he doesn't claim to be self-created in that way. I mean, he's not created. I have to be careful in a zoological sense, but he is an offspring, so to say, of God the Father, and therefore, if we human beings just accept that we are creatures, what's the problem? I mean, as soon as you know that I am created by a benevolent creator, I no longer should worry that much that I'm not a self-created being. I'm not the creator of myself. Yeah, that's. I mean, we all are children of our parents, so we didn't cause our coming into the world, and we walk through the world until we die. So we, at the beginning, at the end of our life, we are not in charge. I mean, well, in the end of life, you can do it a little bit, but even in that sense, you might end your life a little bit earlier, but you cannot prolong it forever, and so to say. And I think the Christian answer would just be to see in Jesus Christ a model who shows you what it means to be a creature and live a life as a creature in charity to others, without worrying too much about why am I not God myself. I mean, Sartre once wrote that all the human beings have the longing to be God, being self-creators, but at the same time he said as an atheist, but God is, there is no God, so we are in a tragic situation. But I think with Kierkegaard and other Christian thinkers, we can see that not as a disadvantage, but just accept that as a reality, and that it means to make the best out of being a creature, to be a co-creator with God. I mean, if we identify God with love, the only hands God has in our world to express this love and act out of love are our hands.
Now, using the authors as a stepping stone, perhaps this conversion from the egoism, vanity, and narcissism, we could draw similar parallels to otherworldly religions, right? We could look towards Buddhism, for example, and a lot of the more Oriental Eastern philosophies with regards to this. I don't want to say renunciation of the ego, but renunciation of the mind, and an observation of the. Because in a sense, if we were to step to the side of Girard for a moment, and we think about this problem of imitation and this problem of desire, right? The Buddha says you suffer because you desire, right? So it's an angle into the same problem, so to speak. So I'm wanting to understand, how did Girard bridge the sort of the view of these two worlds? Because in a sense, my understanding of Girard is that his thought is that the way out of this mimetic contagion, this mimetic problem, is the imitation, as you mentioned, Peter says, imitate Christ. And I view that as basically a conduit, right? Imitate this model of essentially what I think Augustine would say is the mediation of, or the meditation upon eternal goods, right? Eternal things, love, gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, right? An infinite capacity and well of those things. So I would want to also understand that side, because Girard is pointing to say that this is a path, so to speak, out of this problem. But what was his observations on that world? Because it seems like it's sort of in the same channel.
Yeah, I mean, that's a interesting question, and a question that I struggled with for a lot of time. In 2011, I organized a conference, Mimetic Theory and World Religions, that came out as a book, and I invited experts on different religions. The first book of Girard, this mystical masterpiece, that has an opening towards Buddhism, because he, in this last chapter, he refers to a Oriental legend of a person who has to fall into the abyss and just give up the clinging. And Buddhist experts today say this is a famous story of Oriental religion. So there is this opening, and I already said that the last chapter in the first book is also influenced by Simone Weil, and different from Girard, she was very open to other traditions and religions. She studied Sanskrit, so she was looking for parallels in other traditions and saw them. Girard later on really focused on Christianity, Judaism and Christianity, and did a tremendous work to unfold the inside of Judaism and Christianity. And only later he did a little booklet, Le Sacrifice, on the Vedic tradition in India, a very small book, where he hints towards parallels between the Gospels and the Upanishad and Buddhism a little bit, but didn't go deeply enough into that. But going back again to the first book, so you have this Oriental legend there that would be an opening up, and you have Simone Weil, the influence there, but you also have a very strong parallel between the Sufi tradition in Islam and the last book, because the Sufis always say you have to die to your own self in order to arrive at your deeper self. And this is exactly what the great authors experienced and described. This is exactly what Girard himself experienced, although in a Christian framework, but that's the deepest insight of the Sufi tradition. And it means give up the claim that you are in charge of your own self, that you are the God of yourself. This self has to die in order to realize, in order to become aware of the deeper self, that is a self that is given. And in the Sufi tradition, but also in other traditions, you have very often the image that a human being has to become the mirror of God, which is again a imitative thing. If you become a mirror of God, you are also in a imitative mode, but in a mode where you receive and no longer try to do it all out of your own strength. So so there are a lot of possibilities already in the first book of Girard to come to a much broader view of the world religions. I tried to describe it a little bit in the book, and later on I organized also 2 conferences on mimetic theory in Islam, and the best fruit out of these conferences is a book by a Muslim friend of mine who is now teaching at the Papal University Gregoriana in Rome, and he lives in Rome for more than 20 years, and he wrote a book towards Islamic theology of nonviolence in discussion with René Girard. And when I read the final version of the book and I wrote a foreword for it, I was so overwhelmed by joy, because here I really realized how a Muslim theologian could describe the deepest insight of mimetic theory, and what is also very close to my own Christian tradition from the Islamic perspective. So there is much more to do in all different directions of religions. I always thought if Girard's anthropology is really a valid universal anthropology, you would discover resonances in all the great religious traditions. And it's not difficult. I mean, there is a little bit of work on Buddhism and other traditions. I recently did a book and an article on Gandhi and mimetic theory, and astonishing parallels you can find also in this regard. But that would lead to another podcast probably. And
I suppose with my last question would be with regards to looking at the world as it is today, and seeing sort of the, what would you say, the, we mentioned some of these channels, right? Alternative channels of finding things in consumerism and in these other areas. Is I suppose the insight here is to for oneself to question into that, what you mentioned, this kind of common thread between all of these areas of thought, which is this question of the egoism, question of the sense of self, and sort of investigate that question to see if it's a sort of route out of this the chaos.
Yeah, I mean, that's a spiritual question. And just listening to your question, I studied Girard and those things for 40 years and still struggle because sometimes I am still too much interested in my own recognition as a scholar, and all those things work a little bit too strongly and too much in order to fulfill my lack of being. Maybe if I would have gone further into the saintly way, I wouldn't even do the podcast with you, because I would just enjoy the nature outside and so on. So it's a lifelong question, I think, that you again and again have to remind yourself about those things, and not forget what are the most essential things for human beings: to have good relationships of love with the people around you, and most of the other things are not that much important, and that can help you. When I read Girard's first book for the first time, really eagerly, I realized myself as a quite shallow, snobistic person, and maybe I have to read it again.
Fascinating. I feel like, Dr. Palaver, we could continue this discussion, but we're very, very appreciative of your time here to come onto the show and to explain and explore a little bit more of mimetic theory. So with that being said, I want to thank you again for joining the show, and to all the listeners here, thank you for tuning in. You can subscribe on all of the various platforms available, and we will catch you in the next episode. Thank you again so much, Dr. Palaver.
Thank you.